The story begins in the dense, humid air of Georgia's backcountry in the year 1840, where the morning mist hung like a veil between the rows of cane and cotton. On the outskirts of Dawson County, a plantation known as Briar Hollow stirred to life. It was not the kind of place marked on maps or written about in local records that lived quietly in the shadow of the bigger estates, its wealth hidden behind fences and its cruelty swallowed by silence. The land had been cleared a generation earlier by men and women whose names were not remembered, only recorded by numbers and ledgers and ink that bled with humidity. But that year, the record would be broken by two names whispered in the quarters and remembered in stories. Long after the fields were gone, Elsie and Elijah. They were twins born into bondage, a boy and a girl whose bond would come to test the unwritten laws of their world and awaken the darkest instincts of those who ruled over them. Elsie was older by minutes, but it was Elijah who carried himself like the protector. They shared the same quick eyes, the same narrow hands that could pluck a splinter from wood or a thorn from skin. Their mother, Mariah, was one of the few women still standing from the first generation brought to Briar Hollow. She was known for her quiet strength, her unbroken spirit, and her ability to heal wounds that even the overseer's doctor wouldn't touch. It was she who told them to stay together no matter what came. But in the South of 1840, no promise between enslaved kin could stand against the laws that ruled flesh and blood. The twins had grown up in a time when rebellion was a memory and submission was survival. They had seen men disappear for looking along at a white face, and women whipped for holding on too long to a child that had been sold. Still, beneath that terror, a rhythm of defiance pulsed in small, secret gestures, the passing of letters written in charcoal, the gathering of seeds for hidden gardens, the whispered hymns that transformed grief into prayer. By their 17th year, Elsie and Elijah were part of that hidden world. They worked different parts of the plantation, Elijah in the fields, Elsie in the house, but met each night by the creek that cut through the cypress grove, behind the slave quarters. There, under the crooked moonlight, they shared the fragments of freedom. They had gathered a few pages from a discarded Bible, a rusty key they'd found buried in the dirt, an old map Elijah had drawn from memory of where the land sloped westward toward the hills. It was a child's dream turned into a desperate plan to find the small pocket of maroon settlements, rumored to exist beyond the Chattahoochee River, where escaped families lived off the swamps and the soil. But dreams like that, even whispered, had consequences. The overseer, a man named Dillard, was not the kind to miss small movements or shared looks. He was known for keeping ledgers not only of work done, but of words spoken, tracking who talked to whom, who smiled when they shouldn't, who sang when the others stayed quiet. When he caught wind that the twins were hiding something, perhaps books, perhaps ideas, he began to watch them closely. He did not yet know what they were planning, but suspicion was enough to put the weight of law behind his gaze. The town's law, as it was called, was not written on paper. It was a web of ordinances and customs woven between white families who had built their lives on the control of black bodies. In Dawson County, one of those unwritten decrees was that no enslaved family could conceal the identity of their kin, particularly if those kin were born of mixed blood. In the years following Nat Turner's rebellion, fear had poisoned every small town across the South. The thought that blood could cross color, that a family might hide a child of divided lineage, was seen not as sin, but as treason. And when Elijah was found sneaking into the old mill one night carrying a wrapped bundle, a worn shirt, some bread, and a lock of hair tied with string, the lock came crashing down. The bundle had not been for him, but for the child of another woman, a half-white boy named Samuel, whose mother had died months earlier. Mariah had told the twins that Samuel was blood kin through a father they would never know. To protect him meant to risk everything. Yet the town's law was clear. Concealing a mixed child was harboring forbidden blood. That morning, when Dillard and the deputies dragged Elijah to the clearing, the plantation fell silent. Elsie tried to intervene, but she was thrown aside. They made an example of him, not with a whip, but with confinement. He was chained in the corn crib, the smell of rot and rats his only company. For 10 days under the guise of correction, when he emerged, the boy who had once smiled under the sun no longer looked up. His wrists bore the marks of iron. His back had healed unevenly from old lashings reopened by the damp. But worse was the silence that followed him. The other enslaved workers stopped speaking to him, not from cruelty, but from fear. They knew what came next. Punishment was never limited to one solid spread, like the mold on old wood, consuming anyone close enough to see a dot in the weeks that followed. Rumors spread that the twins had hidden not only the child, but also papers, birth records, a family lineage that could expose the truth of one of the town's founding families. Some said it was Mariah who had hidden them. Others claimed it was the white mistress, Mrs. Kendall, who had begged Mariah to destroy them when her husband's affair had threatened the family name. The truth was blurred, buried beneath fear and whispers. But when the county magistrate visited Briar Hollow and asked to see the property in question, everyone knew what he meant. The hearing was held not in a court, but in the tobacco barn. The magistrate sat on a barrel while the plantation owner, Josiah Kendall, stood in his Sunday coat, his hand trembling slightly on the handle of his cane. Before them stood Elsie, her face bruised, her eyes steady. She refused to answer when they demanded the location of the papers. They accused her of conspiracy, of hiding evidence that could expose a white family to shame. The punishment decreed by the town's council was both archaic and cruel banishment to public correction, meaning she would be sold at auction not for profit, but as an example. Elijah broke then. That night, when the plantation slept, he fled his quarters and made for the creek. He carried nothing but a candle stub and a carved piece of wood, half of a charm his mother had made to keep the twins safe. The moon was bright, and the cypress shadows seemed to move like ghosts as he followed the path toward the old mill. There, in the hollow where they had once dreamed of freedom, he dug into the dirt with his bare hands. Beneath the soil was a small box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were the papers the town had feared to record, written in an overseer's hand, listing names, births, and one word scrawled in the margin beside Mariah's name, housekeeper preferred by Master Kendall. Below it, in faded ink, the birth record of 2 children, Elsie and Elijah. The father's name had been scratched out, but beneath it, faintly legible, were the initials J.K. When Elijah brought the papers to his mother, she looked at him with a kind of sorrow that seemed older than her years. "You were never meant to see this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They'd kill you for knowing." He didn't care. The revelation tore through him like fire. To be the son of the man who held his chains, there was no redemption in that. Only the burning question of what blood truly meant. For days he wrestled with it, torn between hatred and despair, until finally, as dawn broke one morning, he made a choice that would seal their fate. He went to the main house and placed the papers at the foot of the steps. It was not rebellion. It was surrender, or perhaps confession. But to the town, it was treachery of another kind, proof that he and Elsie had concealed their lineage to avoid punishment. The next day, a notice was posted in the town square. It declared that both twins had acted in violation of local statute and were to be punished according to the ordinance for deception of lineage and concealment of property records. No one spoke of what the ordinance entailed. It was one of those laws too dark to write, too shameful to say aloud. That night, the bells rang from the chapel. The sound echoed across the fields, through the quarters, through the bones of every man and woman who had ever dreamed of freedom. It was the sound that marked the end of belonging, the moment when blood, faith, and family were stripped away by decree. And as the fireflies dimmed and the wind carried the scent of smoke from the town's torches, the story of the twins, once whispered by candlelight, began its descent into legend. Their punishment had not yet come, but already the fields knew the law was not just made to bind bodies. It was made to erase the memory of who they were. And somewhere, beyond the edge of Briar Hollow, in a cabin near the river, the boy Samuel, the child they had tried to save, slept with a lock of hair tied around his wrist. He would not know for years what had been done for him, or what price had been paid. But history, as it always does, would remember in fragments the echo of bells, the rustle of papers, the unmarked grave at the edge of the cypress grove. The world would move on, but the law that destroyed them would linger, an invisible chain, passed down through the silence of generations, down through the silence of generations. The morning after the bells tolled, Briar Hollow felt hollow in name and spirit. A fog had settled across the fields, thick as if the earth itself wanted to hide from what was about to come. The workers moved slower that day, their eyes fixed on the soil, their hands trembling at each command. Word had spread Elsie and Elijah were to face the town's council in public, the first enslaved people in Dawson County ever to be tried under the deception law. It wasn't a real statute, not one you'd find written anywhere. It was a code enforced through fear, an invention of powerful men desperate to protect the purity of their names and the illusion of their control. The hearing was to be held in the town square, where punishments were often turned into lessons. People came not out of duty, but the hunger to remind themselves of their own power, or, for some, their distance from the condemned. Mariah watched them take her children away from the quarters. her body weakened by the fever that had come upon her after Elijah's confinement. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, one hand pressed against the frame for balance, her eyes unblinking. She did not weep. There was no room left for tears. The guards, white men from town, wearing coats of cheap wool and boots caked in red clay, bound the twins' wrists together with a rope that had once tied a mule. The irony wasn't lost on the overseer, who smirked and spat tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Family stays together, don't they?" he said under his breath. Elijah clenched his fists, but Elsie's grip on his arm kept him from reacting. They both knew resistance now would only worsen what was coming. The ride into town took 2 hours along a road that wound through pine and marsh. The twins sat in the back of a wagon between the armed men, their feet bare, their clothes torn from the struggle the night before. People from nearby farms joined along the way, some walking, others on horseback. It was not a parade, but a procession of power. Among them were preachers, merchants, and farmers who had all come to witness the spectacle that affirmed their order. To them, this wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. Each punishment was a reminder that the world must stay in its place. The town square was small, ringed by a church, a store, and a courthouse that looked more like a barn painted white. In front of it stood a wooden stage built for auctions and proclamations. It was there that the councilmen gathered, 5 in total, led by Magistrate Harlan Tate, a man known for his booming voice and the Bible he carried like a weapon. He was a merchant before he became the town's moral authority, trading goods between Savannah and Macon. But what he loved most was the sound of his own virtue echoed by those who feared him. When he spoke, even the cicadas seemed to quiet. "Let it be known," Tate began, reading from a handwritten statement, "that this day, in accordance with the laws and customs of Dawson County, the accused 2 Negroes belonging to the estate of Mr. Josiah Kendall stand trial for concealment of blood and falsification of property records. Their actions endanger the peace of this town and the moral structure that binds it." His words rolled like thunder over the crowd. To the gathered whites, it sounded like order being restored. To the enslaved forced to stand at the back, it sounded like prophecy. Elsie lifted her chin, her eyes sweeping over the faces before her. She saw no mercy there, only curiosity, contempt, and a few rare glimpses of pity too fragile to last. When Tate gestured toward her, she said nothing. Her silence only deepened his rage. "You know the punishment," he continued, his gaze turning toward the crowd. "By the town's decree, they are to be marked and separated, each sent to correction under different owners. The bond between them is hereby dissolved." The crowd murmured, a low hum of approval and discomfort. They knew what marking meant. It was a punishment reserved for those deemed dangerous or deceptive branding, sometimes with initials, sometimes with symbols. It was both physical pain and a permanent badge of shame. Don Elijah tried to speak then, his voice breaking through the tension. "If you mark her," he said, "mark me too." It was the first time he had spoken since the confinement. His voice was hoarse, but strong, echoing across the square. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Tate's eyes narrowed. "Boy," he said slowly, "you already have your mark, the sin of your birth." Then he nodded toward the overseer. "Do it." The smell of iron filled the air as a blacksmith approached the platform. He carried the branding iron in a small bucket of coals, the metal glowing faintly red. On its end was the letter B, for betrayer. 2 men held Elsie's arms as the blacksmith pressed the brand against the skin near her collarbone. Her body jerked, her eyes wide, but her mouth closed tight. The sound that escaped was not a scream, but a single gasp, sharp enough to cut the silence. When it was Elijah's turn, he didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the courthouse steeple as if it might pierce the heavens. When it was done, Tate raised his hand. "They are no longer brother and sister," he declared. "They are separate property. Their bond is void. May this serve as a warning to all who seek to hide the truth." The words carried through the air like a curse. The twins were led off the stage. In opposite directions, Elsie toward the wagon bound for Milledgeville, Elijah toward another headed north. The crowd began to disperse, but not all left. A few lingered, the preacher's wife, who dabbed her eyes behind her veil, a young white girl clutching her mother's hand, staring at the fading brand marks, and in the back, a free black man named Abraham, who had once worked alongside Mariah before buying his freedom. He stood still long after the wagons left, his hands trembling in his pockets. He knew he couldn't save them, but he would remember. That night, the town was quiet except for the rustle of pine and the distant echo of chains clinking in the wagons. Mariah sat alone in her cabin, the fever worsening, her breath shallow. On her table lay the two halves of the wooden charm, the one Elijah had taken, and the one she had kept. She pressed them together, her hands shaking, and whispered a prayer not to God but to memory itself. "Let them remember each other," she said, "even when the law says they cannot." Days turned into weeks. The plantation adjusted quickly, as plantations always did. New slaves replaced the lost, the rhythm of labor resumed, and the story of the twins faded from the daily talk. But underneath that surface of order, something began to change. The others remembered the women who had braided Elsie's hair, the men who had worked the fields beside Elijah. They began to speak of them quietly in a language of survival. The marked ones, they called them, not as insult, but reverence. For in a world where the law erased names and histories, to be marked was to still exist, to defy erasure by bearing proof of it. Elijah's new life was one of silence. He was sent to a smaller plantation near the Alabama line, where the work was harsher and the land less forgiving. The overseer there, a man named Claymore, made it clear from the start that he knew of Elijah's past. "You keep your head down," he said, "and maybe I forget what I've heard." But forgetting was impossible. Each night, Elijah traced the scar on his collarbone and thought of the twin whose mark mirrored his. He imagined her walking the fields under another sky, her hands blistered, but her spirit unbroken. Sometimes he thought he could hear her voice in the wind that swept across the canebrakes. It said nothing he could understand, but it steadied him. In Milledgeville, Elsie's world was colder, more confined. She had been sold to a household in town, a family of merchants who prided themselves on civility, but carried cruelty in the subtler forms of neglect and humiliation. She worked as a laundress, scrubbing linen until her fingers cracked, serving guests who pretended not to notice the faint brand on her skin. At night, she slept in a shed behind the house, where the walls were thin enough to hear the distant bells from the courthouse clock. She counted each toll, marking the passing of days not by freedom's hope but by endurance's measure. The years between them stretched like an unbroken chain, yet memory, fragile as it was, refused to die. One winter, a letter began to circulate among the enslaved in Georgia's interior, a message smuggled through hidden pockets, passed from plantation to plantation. It bore no names, only a small charcoal drawing of two interlocked hands marked with the letter B. It was said to be a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even when families were torn apart, the bond remained sacred beyond law. The origin of the letter was never discovered, but whispers traced it back to Milledgeville, to a laundress who never spoke, and whose eyes held the calm of someone who had already seen the worst. Asterisk by 1845, the law that had condemned the twins was already fading into obscurity. Other towns had newer fears, newer scapegoats, but Dawson County soil kept its secrets well. Some said that during harvest time, when the wind blew from the west, you could hear faint singing from the cypress grove behind Briar Hollow, two voices rising together in a melody too soft to be human. Others claimed the grove itself was cursed, that no cotton would grow there since the day the twins were taken. The overseers avoided it, calling it the Hollow of Betrayal, but among the enslaved, it became a place of remembrance, a sanctuary of the forbidden, a space where blood ties were honored, and the past whispered back to the living. And so, though the law had written their names out of record and their family out of history, their story lived in the mouths of those who worked, suffered, and waited. It lived in secret songs and carvings on cabin walls, in the hands of mothers who traced the shape of the letter B into their children's palms, not as a brand of shame, but as a sign of survival. The years crawled onward, dragging the memory of that day like a shadow that refused to fade. Time was supposed to dull pain, but for the survivors of Briar Hollow, it only sharpened the edges of loss. The plantation itself had begun to change by 1848. Cotton prices were shifting, soil was thinning, and whispers of abolition had reached even the backroads of Georgia, carried on newspapers passed in secret and sermons coated with dangerous hope. But beneath that shifting horizon, the story of the Mark twins still lingered in the bones of the land. Their mother, Mariah, did not live to see the turning of that decade. Her fever had taken her one winter evening when the frost had crept under the door of her cabin. She was buried by the creek where her children once met, wrapped in her own quilt stitched with the faint outline of two hands pressed together. Those who buried her said she looked peaceful. Her lips parted as if whispering names she could finally say aloud again. But stories, once buried, have a way of unearthing themselves. After Mariah's death, the people of Briar Hollow began to speak more freely, not loudly. but with purpose. Old Abram, the freedman who had watched the twins' punishment from afar, had begun visiting the quarters under the pretense of selling candles and cloth. In truth, he came to collect memories. He was part of a growing network of black men and women, some free, some enslaved, who believed in preserving what history tried to erase. He carried a small ledger sewn into his coat, filled with names, birth years, and fragments of stories told in whispers. He called it a book of remembrance, though he knew if it were ever found, it would mean death. In one corner of that book, beneath a faded piece of fabric cut in the shape of a letter B, he wrote, Elsie and Elijah, the marked twins of Briar Hollow, torn, not broken, far from that land. Elijah had learned to live as half a man, half a ghost. The plantation where he labored now was smaller but crueler. The owner, Mr. Claymore, was not content with obedience. He demanded gratitude. Every lash was followed by a sermon on loyalty, every insult cloaked in the language of Christian care. Elijah learned to wear a mask of stillness, to work in silence, to make his body a wall that pain could not pass through. But at night, when the stars pressed low and the cane rustled in the wind, he would trace his scar and speak the name Elsie under his breath, like a prayer or a vow out once in the dead of winter. He found an old book in the ash pile behind the overseer's shed. Its cover was half burned, its pages torn. It was a discarded Bible, likely used as kindling. Inside, he found a passage that stopped him cold, and a mark was set upon them, lest they be forgotten in the land of wandering. He read it again and again, feeling something stir in him that he hadn't felt in years, not faith, but purpose. He began to collect small scraps of words and symbols wherever he could find them. He carved letters into the wood of the slave quarters, etched them into stones near the creek that bordered the property. He could not read all the words he found, but he recognized their rhythm, their power. Language, he began to understand, was its own rebellion. Meanwhile, in Milledgeville, Elsie had become something of a legend among the enslaved servants in town. She spoke little, but listened much, her quiet nature drawing others toward her. She had learned to navigate the dangerous balance between invisibility and influence, serving her white mistress during the day, then tending to the unspoken needs of the enslaved workers at night. Her brand had faded into a pale scar, but it never stopped aching when it rained. She wore a scarf high on her neck to hide it, yet those who knew her story saw it as a sign of strength. One evening, a woman named Ruth, a washer from another household, brought her a folded scrap of paper. It come from a man by the Alabama road, Ruth whispered. Said it belonged to someone marked like you. The note was short, written in clumsy but clear script, still breathing, still bound to you. Remember the creek. Elsie's hands trembled as she read it. The handwriting was rough, likely guided by another hand, but she knew only one person could have sent it. She pressed the paper to her chest, feeling a strange warmth that made her knees weaken. After years of silence, the world had given her proof that her brother still lived. From that night on, something in her changed. She began to move with purpose, her eyes scanning every passerby, every wagon that arrived from the west. Her work never faltered, but her heart was elsewhere. She started saving scraps, bits of thread, small coins left carelessly on tables, and, most dangerously, information. Rumors circulated that a network of safe routes was being formed, connecting free blacks, sympathetic whites, and those enslaved who dared to flee. Some called it the Underground Railroad, though few in Georgia had yet seen it with their own eyes. Elsie didn't dream of escape for herself, not yet, but of reunion, of finding the other half of her life before the world took it away again. Back in Dawson County, the Kendall estate had begun to decline. Josiah Kendall, the man who had once owned Mariah and her children, had fallen into debt after a series of bad harvests. His health waned, his mind decayed. He spent his last years confined to the same house where Elsie had once served, rambling incoherently about ghosts in the grove and voices that wouldn't be silent. After his death, the land passed to his son, a young man raised in the shadow of guilt he did not understand. He found, in his father's desk, a small piece of parchment listing the births of property from the 1820s and 30s. Among them were the names of twins, with a faint trace of initials that looked like his own. The realization struck him with horror, then shame. But instead of confessing, he burned the paper and prayed the wind would scatter its ashes into silence. It did not. The ash clung to his skin, and the nightmare stayed with him until the day he, too, left Briar Hollow for good. The plantation fell into disrepair, its fields overtaken by weeds, its quarters slowly rotting into the earth. But even in ruin, the grove remained untouched. Those who passed by swore they heard whispers among the tree songs that had no words, but carried sorrow and something deeper still, a promise. When Abraham, now an old man, visited one last time, he knelt by the creek and placed his ledger on the ground. He had filled it with more than 200 names, mothers, fathers, children, all bound by stories the world wanted forgotten. But it was the entry for the twins that he lingered on. He opened the book, pressed the small fabric bee between its pages, and whispered, "You're free now." Even if no one else knows, around that same year, in 1850, the world began to tremble with the first signs of the storm that would tear the South apart. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed, spreading fear even into the free states, and the underground network stretched wider, riskier. Elsie heard of it through coded hymns and the whispers of traveling preachers who passed through town under the guise of spreading the gospel. She knew the price of running, but the thought of dying without ever seeing her brother again haunted her more than the thought of a noose dot. So one humid summer night, she made her decision. She left her bundle of clothes folded neatly by her cot, took the small wooden charm that had once belonged to her mother, and slipped into the darkness. The road north was long and cruel, the air thick with the sounds of insects and fear. She followed the river as far as it would take her, hiding by day, moving by moonlight. Every rustle of leaves, every bark in the distance made her heart stop. Yet she pressed on, carrying only one image in her mind: a grove, a creek, and a twin brother with the same scar as hers. After his days turned into weeks, hunger gnawed, exhaustion blurred the edges of her thoughts. But just when her strength began to fail, she was found not by hunters, but by those who walked the hidden paths. A woman named Sister and a conductor on one of the southernmost branches of the railroad took her in. It was a tall, fierce woman with hands that bore the calluses of both labor and care. She never asked for Elsie's name. "Names," she said, "are what they use to bind us. What matters is what you carry." When Elsie showed her the charm and nodded, "Then you carry love. That's stronger than law." For months, Elsie stayed in a safe house hidden among the cypress swamps of western Georgia, tending to others who passed through, men and women with faces hardened by flight, eyes that darted like wild things. Each one carried their own fragment of loss, but they shared a single dream: to live unseen by those who claimed to own them. In their whispered prayers, she heard echoes of her brother's voice, as if his memory had become part of the wind itself. Meanwhile, across the Alabama line, Elijah's chance came unexpectedly. A fire had broken out in the overseer's barn one night, spreading so fast that chaos swallowed the camp. Amid the confusion, he ran not toward the road, but toward the river. The water was black and cold, but it carried him like a cradle. When he emerged on the far bank, gasping, bleeding, he felt a strange calm settle over him. For the first time, there was no order, no command, only choice. He walked for days through forest and mud, guided by a memory stronger than fear, his sister's voice singing by the creek. By sheer fate, or perhaps something beyond it, his path crossed that of Sister Ann's network. When they found him, delirious and half-starved, he was still clutching the broken half of his mother's charm, and recognized the carving instantly. She fetched Elsie, who was tending a sick traveler in the next cabin. When she stepped into the doorway and saw the scar on the man's collarbone, the world seemed to stop. Neither spoke. They simply fell into each other's arms, the years of separation dissolving in a single breath. In the swamps of Georgia, under a moon veiled by mist, the Mark twins were reunited not as fugitives, not as property, but as survivors. Their scars no longer burned. They glowed faintly in the firelight, symbols of everything the world had tried and failed to destroy. And though they knew the road ahead was uncertain, they understood now what their mother had meant. That family was not made by law or blood, but by remembrance. The refusal to forget. Asterisk, the night after Thomas and Emma's capture, the town of Hemlock Hollow carried a silence that was more accusing than any sermon. The sheriff's men had ridden back into town at dawn, their horses splattered with swamp water and pride, dragging behind them the captured twins bound. Trembling and barefoot, they were placed in the old holding shed behind the courthouse, the same place once used to keep runaway slaves before transport. It was said that the walls of that shed could still whisper the breath of those who had prayed for mercy there. The smell of rust and mildew hung heavy in the air, and the floor, damp with rainwater, left cold imprints on their skin. For the first time since they were taken, Thomas and Emma were separated, he in one corner, she in another, a thin wall of rotting boards between them. The townspeople passed by in uneasy procession that day, pretending indifference, yet stealing glances through the cracks in the shed. Some whispered that the twins had betrayed their owners, others that they had desecrated the law of God by hiding what did not belong to them. Yet among the older folk, who remembered what it meant to love something you could not keep, there was a different kind of silence, a silence that trembled with pity, even as fear kept it unspoken. In the courthouse, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and a kind of righteous anger that needed no proof to sustain itself. Sheriff Caldwell leaned on the table, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. He'd spent years maintaining order in Hemlock Hollow, order built on obedience, fear, and the illusion of divine justification. Across from him sat Master Elijah Crane, the plantation owner who had raised the alarm. Crane's eyes were small and mean, set deep beneath a brow that seemed always wet with sweat. He claimed that the twins had hidden their younger sister, a girl named Clara, after she had tried to flee north with the help of an abolitionist preacher passing through. The preacher had been caught and hung in another county. Clara had vanished. For 3 months, there had been no trace of her until one of Crane's men found a child's ribbon buried beneath the twins' cabin floorboards. That was proof enough for Hemlock Hollow. The twins, it was said, had defied their master's authority, concealed stolen property, and lied under oath before God in 1840. That was not simply disobedience, it was a direct challenge to the town's entire order. An order demanded blood. By afternoon, the hearing began. There was no defense lawyer for the enslaved. There never was. The law was clear in its cruelty, yet always cloaked in the language of righteousness. The magistrate, a man named Judge Ellen Vickers, was known for quoting scripture before every verdict, as though it were the Almighty himself speaking through his lips. He began with a verse from Proverbs, "He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind." Then he looked at Thomas and Emma, standing barefoot before him, their wrists still bound, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. The courthouse was crowded, planters, overseers, and wives fanning themselves in the heat. The twins were asked only one question: "Where is Clara?" Neither spoke. Thomas's lips trembled as though he might answer, but Emma looked at him just once, and that was enough. They would not betray their sister, no matter what was done to them. The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke the air. The judge leaned back, adjusted his collar, and declared that silence itself was guilt. The punishment, he said, would fall under the town's covenant law, a remnant of an old colonial code, allowing public punishment for acts considered a danger to communal order. It was rarely invoked, reserved for moments when the law wanted to make an example. That day, it was resurrected for the twins. As word spread, the mood of the town shifted. Hemlock Hollow thrived on fear disguised as morality, and the punishment promised spectacle. Some came out of curiosity, others out of vengeance disguised as faith. The punishment was set for the following Sabbath, in the town square beside the hanging oak. It was to be called the cleansing, a ritual invented by the elders to remind the enslaved and free alike that rebellion carried a sacred cost. In practice, it was public torture sanctioned by prayer. The townsfolk prepared for it as though it were a sermon. The blacksmith repaired his iron shackles. The preacher rehearsed his sermon about obedience and order. Mothers whispered to their children not to look too long when it happened. But they came all the same. The square was swept, the platform rebuilt, and the old oak whose roots had drunk from too many deaths stood ready once again inside the shed. Thomas counted the hours by the sounds outside, the hammering of wood, the footsteps of men. Emma listened to, her mind drifting between terror and prayer. She remembered the day their mother had been taken from the fields for singing a forbidden hymn. How the overseer had said that even music could stir rebellion. It had been raining then too. In the silence that followed, Emma had learned that survival sometimes meant holding truth so deep inside that it became part of your bones. That night, when the guard slept, she whispered to the darkness through the cracks in the wall, speaking to Thomas in fragments only he could understand. She told him that Clara had made it farther than anyone thought, that the preacher's wife, before being run out of town, had taken the child north hidden in a wagon of cornmeal sacks. Emma had seen her go, had felt the brush of her sister's hand one last time before she disappeared into the fog. They had done what love demanded, even if it condemned them. When dawn came, the guards unbolted the door. Thomas and Emma were dragged out into the morning light. The sky was pink with the promise of another humid day, and the smell of wet hay filled the air. They were led barefoot through the main road, past the church whose bell tolled not for mercy, but for order. Onlookers lined the road, some averting their gaze, others staring as though to etch the sight into memory. A few of the older black women, house servants, who had lost children of their own, quietly crossed themselves. In their eyes, the twins were no longer just children, they were martyrs in chains. When they reached the square, the crowd had swelled. The preacher stood upon the platform, Bible in hand, his voice booming over the murmurs. He spoke of law, sin, and disobedience, of how the Lord chastens those he loves. His words dripped with conviction, yet his hands trembled when he turned the page. Perhaps even he could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. The twins were bound to the oak's lower beams, their backs pressed against rough bark that tore into their skin. The sheriff announced their crimes, his voice cracking over the noise of the crowd. They harbored a fugitive. They lied to their master. They broke the covenant. His words echoed off the brick facades of the courthouse and the apothecary. Then came the sentence: public lashing, 20 strokes each, followed by branding. The mark of treachery burned into their shoulders. A hush swept through the square. It was one thing to punish slaves in private. It was another to sanctify it in daylight. Yet the townspeople stayed, unwilling to look away from the spectacle that justified their own complicity. As the first lash struck, the crowd flinched. The sound was sharper than they expected, a sound that cut through every pretense of righteousness. Thomas gritted his teeth, his body jerking against the ropes, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the fields met the sky. Emma bit her lip until blood ran down her chin, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a cry. Each stroke became a prayer, wordless, defiant, soaked in pain. When it was done, and their skin was raw and bloodied, the sheriff held the iron brand to the fire. The metal hissed and glowed, the smell of burning oil mixing with the scent of sweat and dust. He pressed it to their shoulders, and the air filled with a sound that was neither scream nor silence, but something deeper, a tearing of the world itself. When it ended, the twins were cut loose and left crumpled beneath the oak. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring platitudes about justice, order, and the Lord's will. Yet as they walked away, not one could meet the twins' eyes. That night, the town slept uneasily. The preacher dreamed of smoke rising from the ground and the sound of children's voices in the wind. The sheriff sat on his porch until dawn, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey into his cup. Even Elijah Crane, who had demanded the punishment, woke in the middle of the night to the sound of his own cattle lowing in terror. As if the world itself recoiled, Thomas and Emma lay beneath the oak long after sunset, their wounds open to the cool air, their minds drifting between pain and memory. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and Emma thought she heard Clara's voice in the sound, soft, like a hymn carried by the wind. She turned her head toward Thomas and whispered what strength she had left. "She's free." And in that moment, even through the haze of agony, Thomas smiled, a faint, broken thing, but real. They had kept the secret. They had saved what they could. As the stars spread across the sky, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the smell of rain and something older, something that belonged to the land itself. Hemlock Hollow slept, believing the law had been satisfied, unaware that beneath that old oak, the wounded souls were already becoming legend. The ground beneath them, soaked in blood and memory, would not forget, and neither would the generations that followed. Who would whisper the twins' names when the night grew to quiet, as though remembering them might keep the world honest for one more day? The morning after the punishment, a mist rolled across Hemlock Hollow, thick and unmoving, as though the earth itself refused to see what had been done. The townsfolk went about their routines, church bells rang, wagons creaked through muddy roads, and the blacksmith's hammer fell in dull rhythm, but something beneath the surface had shifted. The air felt heavier. The oak in the town square, where Thomas and Emma had suffered beneath the cleansing, stood still against the gray sky, its bark blackened and wet, as if it had absorbed too much sorrow to breathe. The twins had been carried back to the holding shed, unconscious and feverish. Sheriff Caldwell had given strict orders that they were to be kept alive, at least until the magistrate decided whether they should be sold south or executed. Even the sheriff's voice, which once carried authority like a whip crack, faltered when he said it. It was as though the law itself had grown weary of its own cruelty. In the shed, Thomas drifted in and out of delirium. His body shuddered with fever, every breath a rasp that scraped against his chest. He saw flashes of light when his eyes closed, images of fields bathed in gold, of a river that seemed to call his name, of Clara's small hands reaching toward him from a place he couldn't reach. Beside him, Emma lay silent, her skin pale under the lantern glow, her shoulder wrapped in rags damp with blood and ash. A young enslaved woman named Lydia, who worked in the kitchen of the courthouse, had slipped in before dawn to tend to them. She brought cool water and cloth torn from her own dress. Her hands moved quickly, eyes darting to the door with each sound. She said nothing, but the way she touched them with a kind of reverence spoke volumes. She had seen many punished, many broken, but something about these that felt different. It wasn't defiance that burned in them. It was devotion, quiet, unwavering, and terrifying to those who feared anything purer than law. By mid-morning, Lydia was gone, leaving behind a small loaf of cornbread and a scrap of paper, a miracle in itself. For most enslaved could neither read nor risk carrying such things. On it, scrawled in crooked letters, were 3 words: "She made it." Emma stared at the note for a long time, her eyes filling slowly with tears. She pressed it to her chest, whispering a prayer so faint that even the wind could not carry it. She knew now that Clara had reached safety, that her sister's small body was no longer bound by the hands that had shaped their lives. That knowledge became a kind of fire in her, a warmth that burned away fear and filled the hollow left by pain. When Thomas awoke again, she showed him the paper. His cracked lips curved into something like a smile. Even in their ruin, there was purpose left to them. Outside, life in Hemlock Hollow resumed its rhythm of denial. The preacher delivered a sermon on the following Sunday about righteous order, his voice echoing through a half-filled chapel. Yet those who sat in the pews shifted uncomfortably. They remembered the twins' faces, how young they looked beneath the lashes, how their silence had seemed more dignified than any prayer. Some whispered afterward that perhaps the Lord had seen what was done and would bring reckoning. Others drowned their doubts in routine, pretending that order had been restored. But in the corners of kitchens and the hush of fields, among the enslaved, stories began to grow. They whispered that the twins had never cried out, that the fire of the brand had not broken them, that the oak itself had bent its branches to shield them from the sun. It was the kind of story that frightened the masters and fed the hearts of the enslaved. The story of those who endured without surrendering their truth. Weeks passed, and the fever receded. Emma regained strength first. She began to move slowly around the shed, her back straight despite the pain. Thomas was slower to heal. His breathing was shallow, his eyes dim, but his resolve burned steady. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wood, the door creaked open, and Sheriff Caldwell entered alone. His face was lined, his hat in his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stood there, looking at them as though uncertain what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its former authority. "The magistrate's gone to Richmond," he muttered. "No verdict yet. I suppose that means you stay alive a while longer." He hesitated, glancing toward the door, then added quietly, "The Lord knows. What happened in that square wasn't right." The words came out heavy, as though dragged from the pit of his conscience. He left before they could answer, but his footsteps lingered like an echo of doubt. That night, Emma dreamed of the swamp beyond the plantation, the same place Clara had fled through. She saw reeds whispering in the wind, the moon reflecting off still water, and the faint outline of a figure waiting by the trees. When she awoke, the image would not leave her. She told Thomas that perhaps they were not meant to die there. Perhaps the land that had hidden their sister could hide them too. He listened in silence, his hand weak but steady on hers. Escape was madness. They both knew it. Hemlock Hollow was surrounded by marshland and patrol routes. Yet madness was all they had left. Better to die seeking freedom than to rot under the gaze of those who called cruelty justice. Asterisk, the opportunity came unexpectedly. One of the guards, a man named Porter, weary and half-drunk most nights, had taken to gambling behind the shed with 2 others. Lydia had overheard them complaining about unpaid wages and the sheriff's endless demands. "Ain't nobody watching them tonight," one had said. "Let the rats have their prayers." When darkness fell, Lydia slipped back into the shed and whispered the plan. She had arranged for the door's bolt to be loosened. Beyond the courthouse yard lay the drainage ditch that led toward the southern woods. If they could reach the tree line before dawn, they might have a chance. Emma looked at her with disbelief and gratitude so deep it hurt. "Why help us?" she asked. Lydia's eyes flickered toward the window. "Because somebody once helped me bury my child," she said softly, and then she was gone. The night was thick with fog when they slipped out. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo forever, but no one stirred. Their bodies ached. Their movements were slow, but the air outside cool and alive filled their lungs like grace. They crossed the yard barefoot, the mud sucking at their feet, the stars hidden behind clouds. Every step felt like walking through the memory of 1,000 others who had tried before them. When they reached the ditch, they slid down silently, crawling through water and reeds. The smell of decay and freedom mingled in their nostrils. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked. They froze, hearts pounding, but no shout followed. For the first time in months, they felt invisible. Hours passed. The fog thinned as the night aged, revealing the skeletal silhouettes of cypress trees. They reached the swamp's edge just before dawn. The air was heavy with the hum of insects, and the ground trembled underfoot. Emma took Thomas's arm, steadying him as they waded through the shallows. He was weak, his breath ragged, but determination guided him like a compass. Behind them, the faint toll of a church bell broke the morning silence. It was the call to prayer in Hemlock Hollow, the sound of order waking up. They kept moving. By midday, the sun broke through the canopy, and the swamp opened into a clearing. There, half sunken in the mud, stood an old cabin abandoned, its roof caved in, its windows covered with vines. They stumbled inside, collapsing on the damp floor. For hours, they said nothing, only breathing, listening to the wind move through the broken boards. Emma tore a strip of cloth from her dress to bind Thomas's wounds, whispering old hymns their mother had once sung. The place smelled of mold and pine, but to them it was sacred, a sanctuary built of ruin. That night, they lit no fire. They simply held hands and watched the darkness pulse through the cracks. Each heartbeat a prayer that the morning might come. Each heartbeat a prayer that the morning might come. Back in Hemlock Hollow, chaos followed their discovery. Sheriff Caldwell awoke to find the shed door open, the chains broken. He said nothing to the magistrate's clerk, who came asking questions. Officially, the report read, "Prisoners lost during storm presumed drowned." Unofficially, the sheriff knew better. He rode to the edge of the swamp the next morning, staring into the mist. Something in him, perhaps the last sliver of his soul, hoped they had made it. He took off his hat, bowed his head, and for the first time in years, prayed without knowing what for. Days turned into weeks, and rumors began to spread. A merchant traveling from the coast claimed he saw the figures near the old trade road thin, limping, but alive. Others whispered that the twins had been taken in by a group of free blacks near the river settlement. To the enslaved in Hemlock Hollow, it didn't matter whether the stories were true. What mattered was that they existed, that hope had taken human form and slipped through the cracks of a merciless world. The legend of Thomas and Emma became a quiet rebellion, a promise whispered at night between those still in chains. If they made it, so can we. And in the swamp, where the mist still hung thick and the ground hummed with life unseen, two shadows moved slowly toward the horizon. The wounds on their backs had begun to heal, the scars burning whenever the wind shifted. Emma looked at Thomas, his eyes hollow, but shining faintly in the dim light, and knew that even if their journey ended there, they had already crossed the line between bondage and freedom. They were no longer property, nor fugitives. They were proof that love, once rooted deeply enough, could survive even in the poisoned soil of Hemlock Hollow. The swamp became their world. For days, Thomas and Emma drifted through that green labyrinth, surviving on rainwater caught in cup leaves and the bitter roots they pulled from the soil. The land itself seemed to breathe around them, thick, wet, humming with life that belonged to no master. Cypress knees jutted from the earth like ancient bones, and curtains of moss hung low, brushing their shoulders as they moved. The deeper they went, the quieter it grew, until even the sound of insects felt distant. In that stillness, they found something strange, the feeling of being unobserved. No overseer's whistle, no barked orders, no crack of a whip, only the rhythm of their hearts and the whisper of water beneath their feet. For to people who had lived their entire lives under the watchful eye of others, freedom was not the sound of shouting or celebration, it was silence. Heavy, wild, and sacred. Thomas grew weaker as the days stretched on. His body, battered by punishment and hunger, began to fail him. The wounds on his back had turned dark at the edges, and fever crept into his blood like smoke. Emma refused to stop. She half carried him through the muck, whispering to him about Claire, about the stories they'd make her tell when they found her again. Sometimes he would answer faintly, sometimes he only smiled, but even in delirium, his eyes still burned with the same stubborn fire that had carried them this far. Each sunrise became a battle between endurance and surrender. They slept in hollowed logs, wrapped in wet moss, hiding whenever they heard distant riders. Slave patrols had begun sweeping the outer swamps, hunting runaways with hounds and lanterns. But the swamp was vast and patient, and it seemed, in some unspoken way, to protect them. One night, a storm came in from the coast. The wind howled through the trees, and lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. Rain poured down in sheets, flooding the pots they'd made. The water rose fast, swallowing roots and branches, turning their refuge into a moving river. Emma tried to drag Thomas to higher ground, but the current tugged at them like greedy hands. They clung to a tree trunk, shivering, the rain beating against their faces. Thomas's head slumped against her shoulder, his breathing shallow. She screamed his name, but the storm devoured the sound. For a moment, she thought she felt him slip, his hand loosening, his body sinking, but then he stirred. His voice, barely a whisper, reached her ear. "Keep going," and with that, the storm passed as suddenly as it had come, leaving behind a quiet so complete that it felt like the world itself had stopped to listen. By dawn, they reached a ridge of dry land where the swamp gave way to pine forest. Emma built a small fire from wet branches, shielding it with her body. Thomas lay beside her, eyes half open, skin gray with exhaustion. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead and began to hum the hymn their mother used to sing, "Steal Away to Jesus," a song forbidden on the plantation, because it carried double meaning. To the overseers, it was a religious tune. To the enslaved, it was a code of promise of escape, of freedom's path. As she sang, the forest seemed to echo back the faintest fragments, like the ghosts of others who had sung it before her. When the fire burned low, she noticed a faint light flickering through the trees, a lantern, moving slowly. Panic surged through her chest. She doused the flame and dragged Thomas into the shadows. Her hand clamped over his mouth to silence his breathing. The lantern came closer, and with it, a man's voice, soft, cautious, not the bark of a patrolman. "Hello?" it called, low enough that it sounded more like a question than a command. "You don't need to hide." Emma hesitated. Then, through the trees, the figure appeared, a tall man in worn clothes, his beard streaked with gray, a pistol hanging loosely at his hip. Behind him were the others, a black woman carrying a satchel, and a boy no older than 12. The woman stepped forward and spoke gently. "You're safe here. We're friends." Her accent carried the softness of the coastal lowlands. "We came from the river colony. You're near the line." Emma's knees gave out. The woman caught her before she hit the ground, easing her down as Thomas groaned faintly. They worked quickly, wrapping his wounds with clean linen, giving him water from a canteen that tasted faintly of iron and herbs. "You've been out here a long time," the woman said quietly. "You're lucky the swamp didn't take you." She introduced herself as Mabel, a free woman who helped guide runaways toward the north, through a chain of safe settlements along the waterways. "Some call it the River Road," she said. "Others call it God's back door." Emma clutched her hand, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from terror to hope. "My sister," she whispered. "Clara. She went north months ago." Mabel nodded slowly. "Then you might find her yet." After they traveled together for the next week, moving only by night. The group followed hidden trails through the forest, guided by Mabel's lantern and the stars. They slept in abandoned barns and hollow trees, always close enough to hear one another breathe. Thomas grew worse, his fever deepened, and the wound on his shoulder festered despite Mabel's care. Still, he pressed on, refusing to stop. "If I could see the river," he said one night, "then I'll know we did it." Emma didn't argue. She knew that every step he took was an act of defiance against the life they'd been forced to live. Mabel spoke of a ferry that ran quietly from the old mill to the other side of the river, where abolitionists kept a refuge house disguised as a lumber station. "It's dangerous," she warned, "but once you cross that water, the law of Hemlock Hollow can't touch you." On the 7th night, they reached the river. It was wide and black, the surface rippling with moonlight. The current whispered like a secret. In the distance, frogs croaked and owls called, their voices blending into a haunting harmony. Mabel signaled to a shadow across the water, a man with a pole boat, waiting silently. "It's time," she said. Emma helped Thomas into the boat, her arms trembling with exhaustion. As they pushed off, the sound of the pole striking the water echoed like a heartbeat. Halfway across, a gunshot cracked the night. Another followed, splintering the air. The ferryman ducked low, cursing under his breath. From the trees, the faint glow of torches flared. The patrol had found them. "Down," Mabel hissed, pushing Emma flat against the boat. Bullets tore through the darkness, striking water. The ferryman rowed faster, his muscles straining, his face twisted with fear. Thomas tried to rise, but Emma pressed him back, whispering his name like a prayer. The current caught them, dragging the boat toward the far bank. Another shot rang out, closer this time, and Emma felt something hot graze her arm. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the firing stopped. The patrol's torches dimmed, swallowed by the fog. When they reached the opposite shore, Mabel leapt out first, pulling them onto the mud. "Run," she whispered. "They'll search the banks by morning." They stumbled through the woods until the first hint of dawn turned the sky silver. Thomas collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. "We're across," he murmured. "We're free." Emma knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his chest, feeling the faint thrum of his heart. "Yes," she whispered, though she could see the truth in his eyes. He wouldn't last long. His body had given everything it had to reach this point. When Mabel returned with water, Emma was still holding him, rocking gently as though soothing a child. He smiled weakly, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. "Tell Clara," he began, but the words faded before they could leave his lips. His chest rose once more, then still. His chest rose once more, then still. Emma did not cry out at first. She sat beside him as the light grew stronger, the forest waking around them. It felt wrong to cry in a place so alive, so full of the sound of freedom. Instead, she closed his eyes and whispered the hymn again. Mabel stood a few steps away, head bowed. They buried him beneath a pine tree overlooking the river, marking the grave with a stone. Emma carved a cross into it with a sharp rock, her hands steady. "He made it," she said simply. Mabel laid a hand on her shoulder. "And you will too." They reached the refuge house by nightfall. It was small and plain, hidden among the pines, the sound of saws and hammers masking everything from outside ears. Inside, the air smelled of wood and candle wax. A man in a long coat greeted them, a preacher with kind eyes and a voice like worn leather. "You're safe here," he said, leading Emma to a cot. She lay down, staring at the ceiling beams, her body numb, but her mind alive with everything she had lost and found. She dreamed of Thomas's face, of Clara's laughter, of their mother's hands in the field. When she awoke, the preacher was reading quietly by the window. "You have a choice now," he said softly. "Stay or keep moving north. There are people waiting in Philadelphia who help families reunite." Emma looked toward the window, where dawn was breaking once more, spilling light across the floorboards. She rose slowly, wincing from her wounds, but standing tall. "I'll go," she said. "I have someone to find." The preacher nodded. Outside, the river murmured against its banks, carrying the sound of movement, of things leaving and arriving, of life continuing despite all that tried to end it. Hemlock Hollow was far behind her now, but its shadow would never fade completely. Still, she walked toward the light, carrying the names of the dead like prayers on her tongue, determined that their story would not vanish into the silence of the swamp. The dawn after the fire carried no triumph, only a gray, choking quiet that settled over Mill Creek like a punishment that refused to end. The air still smelled of ash and iron, and from the charred outline of what once was the Avery barn, smoke curled into the sky as if the town itself was exhaling its guilt. The twins had vanished into the swamps beyond the cane fields, leaving behind a silence that no sermon could fill. For days, the townspeople scoured the woods with hounds and lanterns, their fear disguised as righteousness. But Mill Creek was built on lies that ran deep into its soil, and some truths refused to be buried. The story of those twins, their courage, their punishment, their flight began to twist through the community like a splinter too deep to remove. Even those who had once cursed them now felt the weight of their own silence. For every search party that returned empty-handed, there were whispers in kitchens and parlors, in the cotton rows and church pews, of what it meant that two enslaved children could defy the order of an entire town. Weeks passed, and rain came along. Heavy storm that erased the footprints at the swamp's edge and flooded the lowlands, where the dogs had lost their scent. Some said it was nature's mercy, others claimed it was God's wrath, washing away the evidence of rebellion. But among the enslaved, there was another interpretation. The earth had chosen to protect its own. The rain became a story in itself, rattled in secret over flickering candles in slave quarters and whispered into the ears of newborns as lullabies. They said the twins had called upon the storm with the strength of their mother's spirit, that the lightning had answered, striking fear into the hearts of their captors. The truth was likely simpler. They had run under cover of thunder, unseen by the eyes that once owned them, but must have their own purpose. In a world that denied them everything, even belief became an act of rebellion. The Avery family, once the pillars of Mill Creek's wealth, never recovered their standing after the fire. The patriarch, Reverend Thomas Avery, stood before the congregation the following Sunday. His voice cracked and haunted. He called it a test, a divine punishment for the town's failure to uphold order and obedience. But even as he preached, his gaze drifted to the blackened fields outside the church windows. Some said his conscience had turned against him. Others said madness had taken hold. Within a month, he withdrew from public life entirely, his sermons left unfinished, his home shrouded in drawn curtains. The plantation fell into neglect, its white fences rotting, its fields choked with weeds. In a strange symmetry, the land reflected the decay of the ideals it was built upon. But not everyone let the story fade. Sarah, the housemaid who had once hidden the twins in her quarters, continued to carry scraps of their memory in her apron pockets, a torn ribbon, a charred coin, a wooden toy carved by the boy's father years before he was sold away. She spoke of them softly, as if they were saints who had slipped the boundary between earth and heaven. To her, the twins had not merely escaped bondage, they had transcended it. Her quiet face sustained others who still labored under the whip. She began telling children their story not as a tragedy, but as prophecy that one day, freedom would come not from the benevolence of masters or the words of preachers, but from the courage to vanish into the storm and never look back. By the time 1845 arrived, the memory of the twins had drifted beyond Mill Creek. Riverboat traders carried their story upriver toward Vicksburg, then further east to Georgia and South Carolina. In each retelling, the details shifted. Some said they had crossed the Mississippi and joined the Maroons' hidden communities of runaways, who lived in the bayous hunting, trading, and fighting off slave catchers. Others swore they made it north with the help of abolitionist preachers disguised as merchants. There were even tales that one of them had been seen years later among the ranks of Union scouts. During the war, guiding soldiers through southern terrain, he knew better than anyone. The truth was lost to time, but the echo of their defiance remained a legend that unsettled those who profited from bondage and inspired those who still endured it. In the decades that followed, Mill Creek's own transformation came slowly, as if the land resisted change until it had no choice. The Civil War would eventually reach its borders, and the emancipation that followed left its fields stripped of both crops and illusions. Freed people built new lives in the ashes of the old order. They founded a small church where the Avery barn once stood, calling it New Hope Mission. The first sermon given there was not about vengeance or victory, but remembrance. An old woman, Sarah, her hair now white as cotton, spoke to a crowd that filled the clearing. She told them of the twins who had hidden beneath floorboards and fled into rain-soaked darkness. Her voice trembled as she spoke their names, Isaiah and Samuel, names the town had once tried to erase. She ended by saying that freedom was not a gift given by men, but a truth carved by those willing to suffer for it. The congregation wept, not just for the twins, but for themselves, for the centuries of silence that had cost them so much after the war. When northern journalists came to the ruins of old plantations to document the progress of Reconstruction, few paid attention to Mill Creek. Its stories were too small, too human for the grand narratives of nation and reform. But among the freed families who stayed, the twins' memory became part of their moral inheritance. Their names were whispered during births and marriages, carved into the cornerstones of rebuilt homes, and sung during baptisms in the muddy waters of the same river that had once tried to claim them. A generation grew up believing the twins had never died, that their spirits walked the forests, watching over the lost and guiding the brave. By the turn of the century, the last remnants of the plantation had fallen. The main house collapsed in a storm, its beams consumed by ivy and moss. A traveling photographer passed through in 1904, capturing what remained: a tangle of vines, a broken well, and a rusted weather vane shaped like a cross. When the photograph was printed in a local paper, the caption read, "Ruins of Mill Creek, once home to the Avery family." No mention was made of the enslaved who had lived and died there. History, as written by the victors, preferred to remember the decay of the master's house rather than the ignorance of those who survived it. Yet in quiet ways, the truth persisted. Descendants of the free community still gathered each summer near the old church site. They brought food, sang hymns, and retold the story of the twins. It was not about revenge anymore. It was about memory, a way to ensure that even the smallest act of courage was not lost to the silence of time. One summer afternoon in 1921, a young schoolteacher from Atlanta named Leila Green visited Mill Creek to collect oral histories for a project funded by the Tuskegee Institute. She sat under a cypress tree with the eldest residents of the area, recording their stories in a leather-bound notebook. When the subject of the twins arose, she listened intently as an old man, nearly blind, recited the story with the slow rhythm of scripture. "They were the first to run," he said, "and because of them, others believed they could too." Leila would later publish her findings in a small academic journal. where the twins were mentioned briefly to names among hundreds of lost lives. But her private notes carried something more profound. It was not the running that made them heroes, she wrote. It was the fact that they stayed alive in memory. Memory is the true rebellion. Memory is the true rebellion.